Good evening and welcome back to tonight's podcast. I appreciate your time as I always do. I'm thankful as I always am, and I am grateful as I always am. Mouth is a little sore tonight. I actually tried to do a recording of this podcast previously, and none of the microphone was not turned on for the whole time. So I'm going to try to get through it this evening and go through this podcast again and talk about what I want to talk about. This is basically going to be a wrap-up of Goliath and the Philistines to all the way till now, Palestine and so forth. So I wanted to talk about not so much who started the Philistines or the origins of the Philistines. I think most people know, so I'm going to go through a little bit of it to get to my point at the end of this. Some may or may not know the origins of the Philistines are said by scholars to be somewhat obscure, but they are not. If you study the Bible to a certain degree and you look at things and you piece it all together, you'll see where they really come from. They are believed to have been part of the Sea Peoples, which is true. They were part of the Sea People. Again, going even further back, we talked about this in the other two podcasts. They were from raiders and migrants who emerged in the Eastern Mediterranean around the 12th century. We talked about the migration from the Aegean Sea, or I should say we should talk about the migration. There are scholars who suggest that the Philistines originated from the Aegean region, from the areas that are now part of Greece and Crete. Their arrival in the Levant is often connected with the larger movement of the Sea Peoples, who disrupted several established mediocre to larger size societies during that time frame. When we look at Canaan and the settlements in Canaan, which you'll know today in history of Canaan and who took over, you go through the history of the land and the surrounding territories. The Philistines settled along the coastal plains of Canaan, establishing 5 major city-states: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Akron, Gath, and Gaza. These settlements are documented not only in Egyptian records, but in the Bible as well, which is, in my opinion, the more important record. But outside records have continually over the years proven the Bible to be correct, as if you didn't know that as a Bible-believing Christian. Like, if you didn't know that already, I don't know what to tell you. You should know that. We'll talk about, let's talk briefly about the cultural assimilation. Over time, the Philistines assimilated elements of the Canaanite culture, including language, religion, social practices, much like the Babylonians, while maintaining distinct aspects of their Aegean heritage. And we look at the conflicts with the Israelites. The Philistines became, I don't know the most notable, but I would say the most, there have been no different adversaries throughout time, but the Philistines became the most notable adversaries of the Israelites, featuring prominently in the Bible. It's not hard to look up. It's not hard to find, such as what I previously talked about in other episodes, the very first podcast that led down this road, of Goliath and the conflicts during the time of the judges and the monarchy. So, while the exact details, according to scholars, of who started the Philistines are difficult to pinpoint, they are not. Their emergence as a distinct group is tied to migrations of different settlements, and there were different patterns that led up to the different ratings in the maritime crossings to where they had to go. Now, the migration from the Aegean, many scholars suggest that the Philistines may have originated from the Aegean region, possibly from the areas that are now part of Greece or Crete. That's where they came from. It's not, I'm always fascinated by this. Well, they possibly, they did. They don't want to lock themselves down to that, but again, true. Their arrival in the Levant is often associated with the broader movement of the Sea Peoples, who disrupted established societies during that time frame. In Canaan, the Philistines settled along those areas, establishing those 5 major cities, and having it so documented in Egyptian records, and more importantly, the Bible, it's clear to see who the enemies were. Over time, the Philistines assimilated elements of the Canaanite, as I said before, and Babylonian religions or religious behaviors with their culture, including language, all their practices and social practices, while maintaining distinct aspects of the Aegean heritage, even existed before the Roman Catholic Church was trying to do it, or tries to do it now. The Philistines are famous for being the adversaries of the Israelites, which was why we have the problems we have today. Now, we look at the history of the Aegean Sea region encompassing that area, surrounding islands, and its rich history, whether it be cultural, economic, or political. I want to look at 2 things, and I will continue through. First, I want to look at the Minoan civilization. Briefly, the earliest significant culture in the Aegean was the Minoans, centered on the island of Crete, and they were thriving, or did thrive, around 3000 to 1400 or so BC. They were known for their rather sophisticated architecture, like the large palaces, and the trade networks, too. Then you look at the Mycenaean civilization following the Minoans. The Mycenaeans emerged on the Greek mainland around 1600 or so. They are noted for their palatial centers and columns and so forth, and their warrior culture and their involvement in trade and warfare. The Mycenaean period is also associated with the Trojan War. You can look that up. That's recounted in the Homer stories, the Homeric epics and Odysseys and so forth. Easy to find. Then you have the Dark Ages, which was about 1100 to 800 BC. After the collapse of Mycenaean society, the region entered a period of decline characterized by reduced population, loss of literacy, and fewer structures, whether it be monuments or anything else. This era is often referred to as the Greek Dark Ages. Now, there's another Dark Age, biblically speaking, but we're not talking about that this evening. You then have the Archaic period, which is around 800 to 500 BC. The Aegean region saw a somewhat of a resurgence with the rise of city-states such as Athens, Sparta, and Corinth. Interestingly enough, I live about a half hour east of Athens, and I'm probably about an hour and a half away from another town here in Tennessee called Sparta. This period was interesting enough, about 2.5 hours away from me is Damascus, Virginia as well. Interesting how we have a lot of biblical names in America, isn't it? This period was marked by the development of trade and the formation of different types of colonies and the establishment of the Greek alphabet as well. The rise of democracy in Athens, which was actually called the Athenian democracy, had its beginnings, and the beginnings of significant philosophical thought also occurred during this time frame. I have talked about that briefly before. If you've listened to any of my podcasts a while back, I talked about Athenian democracy, republic, Roman Republic, but that was a whole other podcast. All right, after that, you have the classical period, which goes from 500 to 323. This era is defined by the Persian Wars, where the Greek city-states united against the invading Persians. The aftermath led to the Golden Age of Athens, characterized by art, philosophy, and even democracy, which is interesting. Take a sip of my water because it's very professional. Then you have the Peloponnesian War. That was around 430s between Athens and Sparta, that ultimately shifted power dynamics and led to the decline of Athenian dominance. Then you have the Hellenistic period. This is where I find the time frame to be interesting. This is to me really where things are. I don't know why. I like the Hellenistic period, the Roman period, because when biblically speaking, it's just an incredible time frame. From my point of view, there's many different. We all have different parts of the Bible and time frames we enjoy. I like this part of it. I thought it's fascinating. It's. I don't know. I don't have a better way of really explaining that. But during the Hellenistic period, which was around the 320 area, that was following the conquest of Alexander the Great. The Aegean region became part of a vast empire at that point that spread Greek culture across the eastern Mediterranean into parts of Asia. This era saw the blending of Greek and Eastern cultures, leading to significant advancements in, of all things, science so falsely called, art and philosophy. Colossians 3, chapter 8, vain deceit. And after that, we have Roman period. That's around 30, and roughly that time frame BC, and that runs in the 300s AD. The Aegean came under Roman control after the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. The region became an integral part of the Roman Empire at that point, facilitating trade and cultural exchange. Roman architecture actually still stands today, and their style of governance influenced not only local practices there and then, but even fast forward to today, you see a lot of those influences. Then you have the Byzantine period, which is around 330. That lasted quite a distance of time. That was around 330 or so, to the 1400s AD. That came about after the division of the Roman Empire. The Aegean region became part of the Byzantine Empire. We could talk about the Byzantine text and so forth when it comes to textual criticism and so forth, but that's not this evening. But they came about, like I said, after the division of the Roman Empire, and that region, being the Aegean region, became part of the Byzantine Empire. This era saw the spread of Christianity and the development of Byzantine art and all that was associated with that. After the Byzantine period, we have what is called the Ottoman period. Now, I'm trying to go through this pretty quickly because I want to wrap this up. It's been a while since I've been able to get in here to do this last podcast to wrap up this series. So if I'm speaking quickly, I apologize, but I want to be brief. I like to get straight to points to make a point sometimes. So anyways, after the Byzantine period came the Ottoman period, which is the 1400s to the early 1900s. The Aegean Islands and the coastal regions at this point fell under Ottoman rule, which lasted for several centuries, actually. This period was marked by diverse cultural influence, and economic activity, particularly in trade. Trade was getting huge at this point in time. Trade has always been big, but at that period, just a lot of things going on, a lot of things. But that brings us up to our what would be considered the modern era, the 20th century to now. In the early 20th century, it saw the rise of nationalism and the establishment of modern Greece in 1830. The Aegean region remained significant for its historical and cultural heritage, influencing contemporary art and politics, and even tourism, but tourism wasn't really a thing in the 18 to 1700s. It was, but really wasn't. So the Aegean's history is clearly characterized by its influential civilizations, their trade and different cultural exchanges and some of its conflicts. In fact, its legacy continues today to impact the Mediterranean region and around the world as well. Now, we get into the Minoans and pagans. The Minoans would be considered one of the earliest advanced civilizations in Europe. They flourished on the island of Crete from approximately 3000 BC to 1400s BC. Their culture is notable for its complex, one might say, society. They had impressive buildings. They had a rich artistic movement or achievements at that time frame in the paintings and frescoes and so forth, as well as its religious practices, which can be characterized as, you guessed it, pagan. So the Minoans practiced a polytheistic religion, worshiping multiple deities, many of whom were associated with natural elements such as the earth, sea, and fertility. Kind of like the five elements you hear more often, New Age, five element type of stuff. They worship goddesses. In particular, it played a central role, suggesting a strong emphasis on feminine divine figures. I actually have a book called the Bible of Eden or something like that. It's very, very bizarre. But everybody who's opposed to God lifts a feminine person up. You have feminists today. How's that working out, huh? When we talk about religious symbols and artifacts, I would say the Minoan art and artifacts that they have found, including the pottery, frescoes, and seals and so forth, they often depict religious symbols and rituals. Common would include serpents, bulls, and female figures, which represent deities. And they use women as deities or priestesses engaged in different rituals. Now, the Minoans constructed various sacred sites, but that's nothing new to them. That many of these pagan societies did so. They had large complexes and so forth, which contained shrines and storage rooms for offerings, much like pharaohs in Egypt and stuff like that. The sites often featured, large frescoes, and there was altars, obviously indicating their religious significance of ritual, of sacrificing and so forth. Evidence does suggest that the Minoans engaged in rituals, possibly, most likely, including animal sacrifices and offerings to their gods. Small g with the plural s, not God, one, because they didn't believe in one God. They had sacred caves and sanctuaries like that, and they've been also discovered. Reminds me of Muhammad and that whole nonsense inside that cave. So there was a connection between worshiping the earth and natural landscapes and stuff like that. Mother Earth, sound familiar? New Ages and stuff like that. Now, I would have to say the influence on later cultures, the religious practices and beliefs of the Minoans influenced cultures or following cultures or subsequent cultures in the Aegean, particularly in the Mycenaeans, who adopted many elements of Minoan religion. The Minoans exemplified a advanced pagan culture with all of its rich but not complex religious practices around nature and fertility and just some evil stuff there. Now, we were talking about the oldest advanced. The title of the oldest known civilization is probably often attributed to Sumer, and that was located in the southern part of ancient Mesopotamia. I couldn't get that word out, which would be modern day Iraq. That time frame was roughly around 4500 BC, roughly thereof. They had also what was called city-states, Sumer, that is. Sumer consisted of several of them, actually. You might recognize one, two, maybe all. Uruk, Lagash, and Eridu. Each city-state had actually functioned independently with its own government and its multiple deities. You might know that name. We talk about Abraham in the Bible. They had developed their own writing system. Sumerians also practiced polytheism, worshiping a pantheon of gods related to what? Natural forces and stuff like that. They built the ziggurats. I think Saddam Hussein actually tried to bring those ziggurats back. So when we talk about the legacy here, we talk about Sumer's influence that extended beyond its time, impacting civilizations in Mesopotamia such as the Akkadians, Babylonians, and the Assyrians. How hugely important is that knowledge? Let's talk a little about Dagon. Dagon was an ancient deity associated with fertility and grain and just outright evilness. I don't know how else to say that. It had Mesopotamian roots. Dagon appears in Sumerian texts, and he was worshipped in various forms in ancient cities like Mari and Ebla. Now, I may have mentioned Mari and Ebla in another podcast. I'm not 100% sure. I think I did, but maybe not. It's been a while since I've been able to get in here, like I said before, to finish this up. You have the Philistine Philistine connection. By the time of the Philistines, Dagon had actually evolved into a major deity, as if he wasn't a large one already. Often depicted as a fish-like figure. Makes you not want fish. The Philistines regarded him as a god of fertility. Again with the fertility and grains and all that type of stuff. Now, when we look in the Bible, the Philistine god, what Philistine god? Dagon. Dagon is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the story of Samson, in the context of the Ark of the Covenant being captured by the Philistines in the first book of Samuel. After the ark is taken to the temple of Dagon, it is found overturned before the statue of Dagon, signifying God's superiority. Dagon's dual nature, part human, part fish, symbolized both terrestrial and aquatic fertility. Isn't that crazy? That's nonsense. But it was reflecting the importance of both land and sea in Philistine culture, because the Philistines were the sea peoples who go back to Babylon, go back to Sumeria. They've been against God all the way along the line. So with the rise of monotheistic religions and the eventual conquest of the Philistines, Dagon's worship declined. It did not. It took different forms. It never left. By the time the Roman Empire, references to Dagon were rare. Not true. Check out the hat. It has never, like the Roman Empire just side-shifted into Roman Catholicism. We talked about this before. And he wasn't mythological. He is, but isn't. They still worship him as if he was real. That's the important thing to understand. They still worshipped him as he was real. His influence not just lingered, but it stayed, but it just took in different forms, and even itself. Now, the history of Baal. Baal is a prominent ancient Near Eastern deity associated with storms, rain, fertility. Again, always these things that, they always have to have some little god to be in charge of things. There's one true God, we know that. But he was worshipped particularly in the Canaanite and the Phoenician cultures. Now, I've talked about Phoenician culture a long time ago, Phoenicia. But anyways, now his worship had spanned just forever. It's still here today. I will argue that all day long. Still here. Baal has Canaanite roots as well. Baal is in several different Semitic languages, and he was worshipped primarily as the god of storms and fertility again. He was often actually depicted as a young warrior. Now, listen closely for a second. He was depicted as a young warrior holding or wielding a thunderbolt. Does that sound familiar to you? It should. Then there was something called the Baal cycle. The Ugaritic text discovered in the ancient city of Ugarit, which is now Syria, it's a city in Syria, contain a collection of stories known as the Baal cycle. They described all Baal's battles against the sea god and the death god, and again, emphasizing fertility and seasonal cycles. Insanity, I tell you. It's just how people believe these things, but we weren't there in that time frame. It's just when you can't believe in God, but you got to believe in everything else but the one true God. Which I find also interesting is he was known as a storm god. Baal was believed to be able to control rain and storms. Reminds me of Jesus, doesn't it, in the boat? Well, Baal does not. Please don't get me wrong. When he stilled those winds, he quieted the storm. Only God can do that. God, not Baal, this fake God. Real God. In the Hebrew Bible, Baal is frequently portrayed as a rival to God, because he is. There were those Israelites who did worship him, sadly, but mostly that was during the in times of or the periods of apostasy. Then there's the story of Elijah and the prophets on Mount Carmel. So you have that going on there. So with the spread of monotheism, again, they feel like he died out, but he didn't. Again, same thing. He did not go anywhere. Then there's Ashtaroth. Ashtaroth was often associated with the Canaanite goddess Asherah and the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar. That should be familiar to most folks. A prominent figure in ancient Near Eastern mythology. Not mythology. Again, I will agree with mythology as in, yeah, it wasn't a real god, but they worshipped her as one. Now, her worship, same thing. It just reflects the worship of fertility and love and war, religion. Now you look at Canaanite roots. Astaroth was a major deity in the ancient Canaanite pantheon, and was often, like I think I mentioned this before, she was often worshipped alongside Baal. She had a dual nature of nurturing and destruction. It's like bipolar. Not making fun of people who have been diagnosed with bipolar. I'm just saying. They talk about a mythological contact, because in Canaanite mythology, Astaroth was often linked with Baal, as I mentioned before. They were supposed to represent a complementary force of nature and stuff like that. Get out of town. And again, a lot of texts have been discovered from Syria that have these people in them. Again, look where we come from. So in the Hebrew Bible, Ashtaroth often referred to as Asherah, or the Queen of Heaven. Remember that term? We talk about that. The worship of Ashtaroth is condemned, obviously, and her altars are often destroyed in efforts to purify worship practices. I.e., 1 Kings chapter 11 or 12 or 11, something like that. Despite biblical condemnation, which should exist, Ashtaroth influence persisted. Some people never learn. And then her worship, like many others, Baal and so forth, often blended with local practices, kind of seeping in, kind of like the Roman Catholic Church. So when we look back at this, they say the history of Palestine is complex and multifaceted, shaped by like different cultures and religions, and they make it seem so innocuous, that's not the word. They make it sound like, oh, it's just, no big deal. No, they're very specific. Satan has been doing this for years. For thousands of years. Whether it be in the ancient period with the Canaanites, the Israelite kingdoms, the different empires like the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, whether it be the Hellenistic and Roman periods with Alexander the Great throughout the Roman rule, the Byzantine and Islamic conquests, the Crusades in the Ottoman period. Right up to now, if you think about it, the 20th century developments have happened now with the British Mandate. After World War I, when Palestine came under British control, leading to rising tensions between Jewish and Arab communities. What about the UN? In 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan to create separate Jewish and Arab states, which was accepted by Jewish leaders but rejected by Arab leaders. Or the Declaration of the State of Israel in 1948. How about 1967? The Oslo Accords. The ongoing conflict has been ongoing forever. And I mean that almost forever. Go all the way back to King David. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict continues today, but has always been there. Nothing new. In fact, the term Palestine first appeared in historical texts in the 5th century when the Greek historian Herodotus, or however you want to pronounce his name, referred to a region or an area he called Philistia, which corresponded to the land inhabited by the Philistines along the coastal areas at that time frame, which is present-day Gaza, with the Ekron and so forth. However, the term Palestine was popularized later by Romans. Because in the 2nd century A.D., after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Roman Emperor Hadrian renamed the province to Judea, Judean Syria, Palestina, something like that, using the name to diminish Jews and diminish Jewish ties to the land. The designation that he gave solidified the use of the word Palestine in reference to the region. They're not native from there. They're native from elsewhere. So the name has been associated with the entire geographical area, especially with the modern day, and I use this loosely, modern day Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it's always been. So from Goliath, from Sumer to Babylon to sea peoples coming across the bottom where Yemen is, and they traveled all the way up. They're in the Aegean region. They become the sea peoples. They come across. Satan has had a plan the whole time. It will fail ultimately, and has failed so far. And he picked up certain areas over time, but in the end, God completely wins. We know that. But Palestine is only Philistines. They're the Philistines, Babylonians, all the evil that's been going on forever. So that wraps it up. From Goliath to Palestine. That's where we're at. So when they say, oh, we can fix it, we can change it, we can do this or that, and we'll help with this, you're not going to do anything ever at any point. It's been going on forever, and it'll go on until the return. When the catching away happens, my friends, then this all begins to fall apart. Well, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate your time, as always. And that wraps up that from pretty much Goliath to Palestine there. With that, I wish you God bless you. Have a beautiful evening. I wish you God bless you. That's an interesting sentence. God bless. Have a beautiful day. Have a beautiful evening. See you next time around. Good night.